December 1987. The world knew Ace Frehley as Space Ace, the silver-masked guitar hero who had helped Kiss become the biggest rock phenomenon of the 1970s. But on that cold winter morning in the Bronx, standing in front of his father's casket, with a Gibson Les Paul in trembling hands, Ace was just Paul Daniel Frehley, a son trying to keep the most important promise he'd ever made. What happened in those next few minutes would reveal something about fame, family, and the crushing weight of living behind a mask that even his closest friends never fully understood. The days leading up to that moment had shattered everything Ace thought he knew about himself. He'd been in Los Angeles, working on demos for what would become Frehley's Comet, his new band after the catastrophic split from Kiss 5 years earlier. The phone call came at 3 a.m. His mother's voice was barely recognizable through the tears. His father, Carl Frehley, had suffered a massive heart attack. By the time Ace could get a flight back to New York, it was too late. The man who had first put a guitar in his hands, who had worked double shifts at the electric company to afford that first Les Paul copy, who had stood in the back of arena shows watching his son become a rock god while never quite understanding the music, was gone. Carl was 72 years old. Ace arrived at the family home in the Bronx at dawn, still wearing the leather jacket and torn jeans from the studio session he'd abandoned. The house looked smaller than he remembered, like everything from his childhood had shrunk while he'd been away becoming famous. His mother opened the door, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then she said something that would haunt Ace for the rest of his life. "He was so proud of you, Paul. He never knew how to tell you, but he was so proud." That's when Ace realized he'd spent 15 years chasing stadiums full of strangers' approval while never quite earning the one that mattered most. Before we continue with this remarkable story, if you appreciate deep dives into the human moments behind rock's greatest legends, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This is a story about more than music. It's about the price of fame and the promises that define us. To understand what happened at Carl Frehley's funeral, you need to understand the relationship between father and son. A relationship that was both the foundation of Ace's success and the source of his deepest insecurities. Carl Frehley was a practical man, a World War II veteran who believed in honest work, paying your bills on time, and not drawing attention to yourself. When young Paul started obsessing over guitars in the early 1960s, Carl didn't see it as a career path. He saw it as a hobby, something to keep a restless kid out of trouble. But there was one thing Carl understood about his son. The boy had something in his hands, some kind of natural gift that made the guitar sing in ways that didn't make sense for someone who'd never had a formal lesson. In 1964, when 15-year-old Paul begged for a real electric guitar, Carl made a deal with him. "Work with me on weekends, help me with electrical installations, prove you're serious, and I'll get you that guitar." Paul worked every Saturday and Sunday for 6 months, crawling through attics, pulling wire, getting electric shocks that his father laughed off as learning experiences. And true to his word, Carl bought his son a Gibson Les Paul Jr. Not the expensive custom model that Paul wanted, but a guitar nonetheless. A real guitar. The day Carl handed it to him, he said something Paul never forgot. "This cost me 3 weeks' pay, son. Don't waste it." Paul didn't waste it. By 1973, he'd transformed himself into Ace Frehley, lead guitarist for Kiss, a band that was about to become the most theatrical, successful, and controversial rock act in history. The silver makeup, the space-themed costume, the smoking guitar, the persona of Space Ace, an alien visitor who communicated through screaming guitar solos. It was as far from Carl Frehley's world of electrical work and practical living as you could possibly get. and Carl didn't know what to make of it. He'd come to a few early Kiss shows, standing in the back of small clubs in New York, watching his son in full makeup and platform boots, and you could see the confusion on his face. This wasn't music the way he understood music. This was theater, spectacle, something that felt more like a circus than the jazz and big band sounds he'd grown up with. But Carl kept coming to shows, even as Kiss got bigger, even as they moved from clubs to theaters to arenas to stadiums. He'd stand in the wings, wearing earplugs, watching 70,000 people scream for his son, and he'd shake his head in amazement. After the 1977 Madison Square Garden show, the peak of Kiss's imperial phase, Carl came backstage and found Ace in the dressing room, still in full makeup, surrounded by hangers-on and groupies and people who wanted something from Space Ace. Carl waited until the room cleared a bit, then pulled his son aside. "Paul, I don't understand this music. I don't understand these costumes and the fire and all this craziness. But I understand work ethic, and I can see you work hard at this. I'm proud of you." It was the closest thing to approval Ace ever got from his father, and he held on to those words through everything that came after. What Carl Frehley didn't see, what he couldn't see from his position in the wings, was that his son was drowning. Behind the silver makeup and the space alien persona, Ace Frehley was losing himself. The alcohol and pills that had started as performance fuel were becoming the only way he could function. The creative tension within Kiss, particularly with Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons, was eating him alive. And worst of all, Ace was beginning to suspect that Space Ace was more real to the world than Paul Daniel Frehley had ever been. But before we get to the breaking point, before we understand how all of this led to that frozen moment at his father's funeral, we need to talk about 1978 and the decision that would change everything. 1978 was supposed to be Kiss's victory lap. They were the biggest band in the world. 4 consecutive platinum albums, a television movie that got massive ratings, action figures that outsold Star Wars merchandise. But inside the band, something was fracturing. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley, the band's primary songwriters, were becoming increasingly controlling. Peter Criss, the drummer, was struggling with his own demons. And Ace, caught in the middle, was starting to feel like Space Ace was the only part of him that mattered. The silver makeup had become a prison. That's when Casablanca Records, Kiss's label, made an unusual proposition. Each band member would record a solo album. All 4 albums would be released on the same day, an unprecedented marketing gambit. For Ace, it felt like a lifeline, a chance to prove he was more than just the guitar player in makeup, a chance to show he could write songs, produce tracks, be a complete artist. He threw himself into the project with an intensity that surprised everyone, including himself. He worked 18-hour days in Electric Lady Studios in New York, the same studio where Jimi Hendrix had recorded. He brought in session musicians he trusted, and most importantly, he chose songs that meant something to him personally, including a cover of a 1960s song called New York Groove that reminded him of growing up in the Bronx. When the 4 Kiss solo albums were released in September 1978, something unexpected happened. Ace's album outsold the other 3. New York Groove became a legitimate hit single, reaching number 13 on the Billboard charts. For the first time, Ace Frehley had proven he could succeed without the Kiss machine, without Gene Simmons's business acumen or Paul Stanley's showmanship. He'd done it on his own talent, and it terrified him. Because success outside Kiss meant a choice was coming, a choice between the mask and the man. Between Space Ace and Paul Daniel Frehley. Carl Frehley bought his son's solo album the day it came out. He listened to it in his workshop in the basement of the family home, surrounded by electrical equipment and tools, and for the first time, he actually understood what his son was doing. New York Groove wasn't about makeup or fire-breathing or platform boots. It was about home, about the streets they'd walked together, about being from somewhere and never quite leaving it behind, no matter how famous you became. Carl called Ace after listening to the album and said, "Now this I understand. This is you, Paul. Not that space character. This is you." But understanding who you really are and having the courage to be that person are two different things. And for Ace Frehley in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the gap between those two things was filled with Jack Daniels, pills, and a self-destructive streak that would nearly kill him. What happened next would push Ace to the edge and force a confrontation with his bandmates that would ultimately destroy Kiss as the world knew it. But it would also set him free. The years between 1978 and 1982 were a slow-motion car crash. Kiss kept making albums, kept touring, but the magic was gone. The makeup that had once felt like power armor now felt like a straitjacket. Ace's drinking and drug use escalated to the point where he could barely get through shows. There was an infamous incident in 1980 in Albany where Ace was so intoxicated he couldn't tune his guitar between songs. The fans noticed. The band noticed. But nobody knew how to stop it. Gene Simmons, ever the pragmatist, tried to manage Ace like a business problem. Paul Stanley, hurt and frustrated, pulled away emotionally. Peter Criss left the band entirely, and Ace felt more alone than ever. His father noticed too. Carl would call Ace after seeing particularly rough performances on television or reading troubling interviews in rock magazines. "Paul, what are you doing to yourself? This isn't who you are." But Ace couldn't explain it. How do you tell your father that you feel like you're disappearing? That the persona you created to feel powerful has consumed the person you used to be? That you're not sure Paul Daniel Frehley exists anymore, except in the rare moments when the makeup comes off and you're alone with your guitar and your demons? In 1982, Ace made the decision. He told Gene and Paul he was leaving Kiss. The official statement was diplomatic, talking about creative differences and pursuing solo opportunities. But the truth was simpler and more devastating. Ace was leaving because he was afraid that if he stayed, Space Ace would be all that was left. The real Paul Daniel Frehley would be completely erased. The makeup would become permanent. And he'd rather lose everything, the fame, the money, the security, than lose himself completely. Carl Frehley didn't understand the decision at first. "You're walking away from the biggest band in the world?" But Ace tried to explain it the only way he could. "Dad, you taught me not to waste the guitar you gave me." "Well, I'm wasting it now. I'm wasting everything. I need to figure out who Paul Frehley is when he's not pretending to be from outer space." What Ace didn't tell his father, what he could barely admit to himself, was that leaving Kiss was the easy part. The hard part would be learning to live without the mask, to face the world as himself, to discover if there was anything left of Paul Daniel Frehley worth saving. And he was about to find out in the most painful way possible. The years after leaving Kiss should have been liberating. Ace formed Frehley's Comet, a band where he was in complete control, where he could play the music he wanted, where he didn't have to share the spotlight or compromise his vision. The band's first album, released in 1987, was actually quite successful, spawning a hit single called Rock Soldiers, that addressed Ace's struggles with addiction directly. For the first time in years, Ace was creating music that felt authentic, that came from his actual experiences rather than from the Space Ace character. But the addiction didn't magically disappear just because he'd removed the makeup. Recovery is not linear, and Ace's path was particularly rocky. There were relapses, lost weekends, mornings where he woke up not remembering the night before. His relationships suffered. His finances suffered. There were moments when he thought about giving up entirely, about calling Jean and Paul and begging to come back to Kiss, to put the mask back on, to let Space Ace take over again because at least Space Ace knew how to function. What kept him going, perhaps more than anything, were the occasional phone calls from his father. Carl didn't understand addiction. His generation didn't talk about it the way we do now. But he understood struggle, and he understood his son. "Paul, you're a Frehley. We don't quit. You fell down, you get back up. That's what we do." Those calls were lifelines, reminders that someone saw him as Paul, not as Space Ace, not as the former Kiss guitarist, but as a person worth fighting for. By late 1987, Ace was in the best place he'd been in years. He'd been sober for 4 months, his longest stretch since before joining Kiss. Frehley's Comet was preparing for a major tour. He'd reconnected with his family, spending more time in New York, rebuilding relationships that fame and addiction had damaged. He'd even started calling his father regularly, sometimes just to talk, to hear Carl's voice, to feel grounded in something real. In November, Ace visited his parents' home in the Bronx for Thanksgiving. He brought his Gibson Les Paul, the expensive custom model he'd always wanted as a kid, and he played for his father in the living room. Carl sat in his old armchair, the same chair he'd sat in when Paul had played that first Les Paul Jr. back in 1964, and he listened. When Ace finished, Carl said, "You know what I'm most proud of? Not the fame or the money or any of that. I'm proud that you're still playing. You didn't give up on it." A few weeks later, Ace got the call about his father's heart attack, and suddenly, nothing else mattered. Not the tour, not the album, not his carefully maintained sobriety. His father was gone, and with him went the one person who had always seen Paul Daniel Frehley clearly, without the distortion of fame or character or persona. At the funeral home, as Ace stood over his father's casket, his mother pulled him aside and told him something that would change everything. "Your father had a request," she said. "Before he died, in the hospital, he made me promise to tell you. He wanted you to play guitar at his funeral, not Space Ace, just you, Paul. Just play something from your heart." And that's when Ace realized the weight of what he was being asked to do. Because playing from his heart meant playing without the armor of his persona, without the protection of being someone else. It meant being vulnerable in front of everyone. It meant being seen. The funeral was held at a small Catholic church in the Bronx, not far from where Ace had grown up. It was packed with family, neighbors, Carl's friends from the electric company, people who had known the Frehleys for decades. Some of them recognized Ace, though without the makeup, he was less immediately identifiable. There was a strange feeling of anonymity that he hadn't experienced in years. These people weren't there for Space Ace. They were there for Carl Frehley, and by extension, for his son Paul. Before the service started, Ace sat in a small room off the main chapel, holding his Gibson Les Paul. His hands were shaking. He hadn't played guitar sober in front of people in longer than he could remember. There had always been something, alcohol or pills or the protective distance of the Space Ace character, something between him and complete exposure. But his father had asked for this. Had asked for Paul, not the character. And after everything, after all the years of seeking his father's approval, of trying to bridge the gap between the son Carl had raised and the rock star the world had created, Ace had to honor that request. The priest, Father McKenna, who had known the Frehley family for years, gave a simple, heartfelt eulogy about Carl's life, his service in the war, his dedication to his family, his work ethic, his quiet kindness. Then he turned to Ace and nodded. It was time. Ace stood up, guitar in hand, and walked to the front of the church. The congregation fell silent. He looked at his father's casket, closed and covered with a simple arrangement of flowers that Carl would have considered too expensive, but would have appreciated anyway. Ace closed his eyes and started to play. He hadn't planned what to play. No set list, no rehearsal, just whatever came out. What emerged was something between a blues progression and a jazz melody, styles his father had actually liked. Music that had nothing to do with Kiss or rock stardom or any of that. It was slow, mournful, beautiful in its simplicity. And Ace played it with everything he had, every emotion he'd been holding back since getting the phone call, every regret about time lost, every memory of his father standing in the back of venues watching his son's impossible career, every ounce of love and pain and gratitude. About 30 seconds in, something happened. Ace's hands started to shake. Not nervously, but with genuine emotion that was overwhelming his ability to play. He could feel the notes he wanted to play, could hear them in his head, but his fingers weren't cooperating. The melody started to fragment, losing coherence. He pushed through, trying to hold it together, but then he hit a wrong note, a jarring discord that hung in the church's acoustics. And then another. The music was falling apart. Ace stopped playing entirely. His hands were frozen on the fretboard, unable to continue. He stood there in front of everyone, exposed and failing, unable to complete the one thing his father had asked of him. The silence in the church was crushing. This wasn't a performance where he could throw his guitar to the ground and storm off stage. This was his father's funeral, and he was failing. Again. Then, from somewhere in the congregation, someone started to hum. It was a simple melody, one that seemed to understand where Ace's guitar solo had been trying to go before it fell apart. Within seconds, others joined in, building on that foundation. These weren't professional musicians. They were family members, neighbors, people who cared about Carl and by extension cared about his son standing there struggling. The humming grew into a wordless song, something that felt like a hymn but wasn't any hymn in particular. It was just sound, human voices coming together to hold up someone who couldn't hold himself up anymore. Ace looked up from his guitar, tears streaming down his face, and saw his family, his community, carrying the melody he'd dropped. And slowly, very slowly, he brought the guitar back up and started to play along with them. Not leading, just joining. His hands were still shaking, but now he had support. The voices gave him a foundation to build on, a safety net that meant if he stumbled again, he wouldn't fall alone. The music that filled that church wasn't technically impressive. It wouldn't have impressed any critics or won any awards. But it was honest. It was real. It was Paul Daniel Frehley, not Space Ace, playing for his father with the support of the people who had known him before fame had complicated everything. When the music ended, Ace stood there for a moment, overwhelmed. His mother came up to him and took the guitar gently from his hands. Your father heard you, she said quietly. And he's proud. Not because you're famous or because you're in KISS or any of that. He's proud because you tried. Because you showed up and you tried. Ace couldn't speak. He just held his mother and cried, really cried, for the first time since getting the news. The mask was completely gone. There was no character to hide behind, no persona to protect him. Just grief and love, and the realization that being seen, truly seen, was both terrifying and necessary. After the funeral, as people filed out of the church, several of them stopped to talk to Ace. Not about KISS, not about his career, but about Carl. Sharing memories, telling stories, reminding him that his father had been a complete person outside of being Ace Frehley's dad. It was humbling and healing in equal measure. That afternoon, back at his parents' house during the reception, Ace found himself in his father's workshop in the basement, surrounded by tools and electrical equipment, and the smell of motor oil and metal. And there, hanging on the wall, was that original Gibson Les Paul Jr. from 1964, the one Carl had bought with 3 weeks' pay. Ace took it down, sat on his father's workbench, and played. Just for himself. Just to remember. In the years that followed, Ace would rejoin KISS for reunion tours, would release solo albums, would experience the full spectrum of rock and roll's ups and downs. But he always said that the moment at his father's funeral, when his hands froze and the congregation carried him through, was the moment he truly understood what his father had been trying to teach him all along. That talent matters. Work ethic matters. But the ability to accept help, to show vulnerability, to be human in front of other humans, that matters more than anything. Space Ace was a character who could do anything, who was invincible and untouchable. But Paul Daniel Frehley was just a man, flawed and struggling and real. And it turned out that was enough. That was always enough.